For 4 years of the Second World War, Great Britain waged a secret campaign behind enemy lines in France. At the heart of this struggle was one woman, Vera Atkins. Skillful, meticulous, and dedicated. Atkins was the perfect spy mistress. She ran a unique force of undercover fighters, Britain's women's secret agents. Through sabotage and resistance, they helped cause havoc behind enemy lines. When at the end of the war, many of them didn't return, Vera Atkins embarked on a mission to find them. She tracked them down and brought the Nazis who had killed them to justice. Vera Atkins became a national heroine. But Vera Atkins was not all that she seemed. The meticulous spy mistress had played a role in some of the worst bungling of the Second World War. And this film asks why. Was it simply because Atkins wasn't as clever as she seemed? Or had she knowingly sent agents to their deaths to hide a dark personal secret? July 1940, less than 1 year into the Second World War. In the fight against the Nazis, Great Britain now stood alone. After just 6 weeks of fighting, France had capitulated. Germans overran the country. But British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was determined to fight back. He devised a plan to help Europe rise again. And Vera Atkins was to become a vital part of it. 33-year-old Atkins was a trainee secretary with no military experience. But she had been spotted by an unusual organization, the Special Operations Executive. This was Churchill's strike-back weapon. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, was a new secret service designed to run an underground war in countries occupied by the enemy. Through acts of sabotage, resistance, and subversion, Churchill claimed that SOE would develop a reign of terror to make the lives of German occupiers an eternal torment. SOE was a prestigious club at the heart of the British war effort. Now Atkins was given the opportunity to join it. Journalist Sarah Helm is Vera Atkins' biographer and has spent 7 years researching her life.
She was obviously always an incredibly focused character and driven character, and I think that's very important. She tended to trust her own judgment, so she was always going to achieve a lot.
Atkins sailed through the interview and in April 1941 was recruited as a secretary to F Section. In France, German occupation was playing havoc with F Section's operations. It was increasingly difficult for agents to travel around the country. Young men were often picked up and searched, making an agent's capture more likely. SOE found a controversial solution. Women would be sent behind enemy lines. They would work as wireless operators and couriers. Many in Whitehall were appalled. Women were barred from armed combat and were not protected by the conventions of war. But Atkins viewed things differently.
Vera would have thought it was perfectly fine and that it made a lot of sense. I mean, she would have understood the logic of it, and she would have always thought that women were just as capable as any man. She certainly wouldn't have doubted that.
Atkins quickly put herself forward to oversee F Section's female agents, and Maurice Buckmaster agreed. F Section began a recruitment drive. Yvonne Burney, née Baisden, was just 20 and serving in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force when she was approached by the organisation.
Well, I'd never heard of SOE, neither had anybody else. But I was contacted one day by an officer in the Air Force who said, "I gather you are bilingual, and would you like to do other work, including speaking French?" And I said, "Well, of course, that'd be wonderful." And that's how it all started.
After their initial selection, men and women candidates began their training. They were taught the secrets of undercover warfare, parachuting, hand-to-hand combat, explosives, and marksmanship.
I was swept up in the things that one could do in what we just took as it came. Whatever was presented for us to do, we had to do. And that's how it was in wartime.
Atkins' task was to oversee every step of the women agents' preparation. She made it her job to find out everything about them.
She knew what their background was, she knew where they lived, she knew if they needed more money. And so they felt very confident in her because they felt she was very much looking after them, and she really did know what the details of their lives were. And also by doing that, she was able to assess whether they were up to the job.
Now let's just check you over. Have you anything in your pockets?
The success of an agent's mission relied on the quality of their undercover identity. Many were involved in creating this, but it was Atkins who made the final checks.
She would be the one who would make sure they didn't have, a packet of English cigarettes in their pocket or some giveaway label showing that actually they'd bought their shoes in St. James's or something, and to make sure that the whole sort of French identity had been perfected.
After just 1 year, Atkins had 11 female agents behind enemy lines. They were proving invaluable. Andrée Borel was a working-class girl from the suburbs of Paris, but fast becoming one of the best couriers in the field. Yvonne Roudelat cycled hundreds of miles delivering vital messages and took part in blowing up a 300,000-volt electricity cable near Orléans. Back in London, Atkins followed every detail of their operations. She would spend long hours in the office, watching over the agents who had become her girls. But in the spring of 1943, events happened in France that would see Atkins embroiled in controversy. Reports from the field suggested F Section was in trouble. Agent Francis Suttle was in charge of a resistance network in France known as Prosper. Prosper was one of the biggest circuits operating in France. But Suttle now expressed concerns that it had been penetrated by the Germans. 2 of his best local agents had been captured. And Suttle complained that F-Section headquarters were irresponsible in their methods. That safe houses in France, known as letterboxes, were being misused. Your conception of a letterbox appears to be a place where an agent, usually covered in mud, carrying an obvious suitcase, can turn up at an unreasonable hour. But Maurice Buckmaster put the agent's anxieties down to stress and exhaustion. He chose to ignore Suttle's warnings.
Nobody really expected them in the early days to be caught in the numbers they were. The whole operation was run in an atmosphere of extraordinary arrogance and, to some extent, ignorance and bravery, which was a lethal combination.
Vera Atkins was privy to the same information and should have understood its implications. Especially as among the hundreds of members of the Prosper network, there were several of her girls, including André Borel, Cicely Lefort, Diana Rowden, and Yvonne Roudelat. If, as Suttle suggested, the circuit was infiltrated, you might expect that Atkins would request that the women be recalled to England. But both Atkins and Buckmaster did nothing. For them, it was business as usual. It was a terrible mistake. The Prosper circuit had indeed been penetrated. Hundreds of its members were rounded up and imprisoned. 2 months after sending his first warning, Suttle himself was arrested. And all of Vera's girls who worked for the network were then captured by the Gestapo. And F-Section's errors would get even worse. On July the 7th, it received a message from a radio operator in the field. Gilbert Norman was Francis Suttle's operator and a highly experienced agent. But there was something very strange about his message. Every signal sent by an agent was supposed to contain 2 security checks, deliberate spelling mistakes, agreed in advance with London. If a security check was missing, this was an indication that an agent was captured or compromised. Gilbert Norman's message didn't have its security check. At F-Section headquarters, Buckmaster received the signal. He noted the missing check and, ignoring procedure, sent back a curt reply. You have forgotten your true check. Be more careful next time. More surprising than this was Atkins' reaction. She went along with Buckmaster's decision. Why did Atkins, the meticulous spy mistress, not challenge his mistake? One possibility is that Atkins just hadn't seen Norman's signal. There were, after all, thousands of messages arriving into F-Section all the time. But for Atkins to have missed this one seems unlikely.
She would have seen the signal. If she didn't happen to be in the signals room that day, she certainly would have seen it soon after.
Another possibility is that Atkins saw the message but failed to spot the missing security check. For someone so meticulous, this seems even less probable.
She would certainly have been suspicious, and she would have understood the likely implications.
Or perhaps Atkins had simply followed her superiors. She was, after all, a woman in a man's world. And she held a very junior rank. But Atkins had never been one to play by those rules. One of her superiors had noted on her file that she was somewhat disinclined to accept instructions without argument, requires handling. So how could the spy mistress, known for her attention to detail, have failed to take any action? Perhaps there is another explanation for Atkins' uncharacteristic behavior. Vera Atkins was not all that she seemed. She wasn't Vera Atkins at all. She was Vera May Rosenberg, a refugee from Romania. The daughter of a German Jew, Vera had been born in the Romanian town of Ghelit, where her father ran a lucrative shipping business. Her mother was a British South African born Hilda Atkins, who had Vera raised by English nannies. Vera had lived a luxurious life around Bucharest. But in the 1930s, fascism began to take hold in Romania. The ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic movement, the Iron Guard, was starting to take control. And in 1937, Vera, aged 29, had fled with her mother to England. Two years later, the Second World War began. And by the end of 1940, Romania became an ally of Nazi Germany. This meant that for all her impeccable English manners, Vera Atkins was a citizen from a hostile territory.
You cannot underestimate the absolutely overwhelming importance to Vera of concealing the fact that she was a Romanian-born Jew working inside SOE. She was effectively, for certainly half the war, an enemy alien working inside the most secret part of the British Secret Service.
If Atkins had admitted that she was an enemy alien, she would almost certainly have been interned. And there was another reason for Atkins to keep her identity secret. Being British was a crucial part of her relationship with her girls.
The point being that if any of the agents who she was responsible for had known that, their own faith and trust in their own minder, if you like, would have fallen apart. And Vera knew that.
One of the few people to know her true identity was Maurice Buckmaster. So one possible reason for Atkins not to challenge him is that she needed him to keep her secret safe. And in SOE's disastrous summer of 1943, Buckmaster's protection was more important than ever. Atkins was applying for British citizenship, and Buckmaster was supporting her application. Speaking out against him now wasn't an option. While Atkins and her mother had escaped to London, relatives still in Europe were at risk. Her Jewish cousin Fritz Rosenberg and his wife Karen were trapped in Hungary. According to Sarah Helm's contacts with the Rosenberg family, Atkins decided to intervene.
There is quite substantial evidence from a number of different sources that Vera made a rather extraordinary venture over to Holland at the very start of the war, when she heard that her cousin Fritz Rosenberg was threatened with deportation to a concentration camp.
It seems that before joining SOE, Atkins made an incredibly dangerous journey through Nazi-occupied Holland and into Belgium. There, she may have made contact with the German authorities to bargain for the freedom of her cousin.
There are suggestions that a large amount of money exchanged hands in order to buy off those who were threatening his deportation, and that Vera had performed this heroic act herself by going over in circumstances of some danger and handing over the money.
This contact with German authorities during the war would alone have put Atkins in deep trouble with the British authorities and given her no chance of working at SOE. But some evidence suggests that there was more to the deal than just money.
The suggestion was that the family had possibly agreed to provide information over a period of time to the enemy. Certainly, there was evidence to that effect.
It is almost certain that had Atkins' contact with the German intelligence service been exposed, she may well have been viewed as a traitor.
The idea that they might be employing someone and allowing them to have access to all the secrets who's might have been compromised in this way would be utterly anathema to anybody in the service.
If any part of these stories is true, then Vera Atkins would have had every reason to keep a low profile and not to challenge Maurice Buckmaster.
Vera would have been conscious of all of that in every single action she took while she was working for SOE.
While nobody can be exactly sure why, Atkins kept her silence. Whether because she'd misinterpreted the signal or didn't dare question her boss, or because she was covering her identity and knew that she was compromised, Atkins said nothing to challenge Buckmaster. The consequences were catastrophic. As the missing security check indicated, Gilbert Norman was indeed no longer operating his own radio.
Und hier schon wieder neue Frequenzen.
Instead, it was the Germans.
Und die fliegen heute doch.
They were now playing what they called the Funkspiel, or radio game. It was one of the most devastating espionage tactics of the war. German agents in control of British radios would call in drops of supplies, weapons, and agents that would fall directly into German hands. F-Section's blunders, which could so easily have been avoided, would cost hundreds of lives. Because F-Section continued to send agents to the field. And in February 1944, Atkins, unwittingly in communication with a radio operated by the Germans, organized the deployment of a talented new agent. Madeleine Dammament was a remarkable young woman who had fled from France after running an escape route for Allied prisoners. A devout Catholic, she was living in a convent in Hertfordshire when she volunteered to work for SOE. Madeleine was to be flown into central France. and Vera Atkins was there to see her off. Madeleine had been told of the risks that she faced, but not of the most important one. That the F Section network had been infiltrated and their radios compromised. When Madeleine landed in a field near Chartres, she wouldn't be heard from again. Three months later, the Allies were preparing for D-Day and the liberation of France. F Section were to be part of it. All over France, its surviving networks were to embark on a campaign of sabotage. Telephone and railway lines were cut, bridges demolished, and German units attacked. Yvonne Baseden had been dropped into France 3 months earlier. Now, she was to play a vital role. She helped organize one of the biggest supply drops in SOE history.
We had to choose grounds where the resistance could receive material from England or from the States or whatever. One of our grounds was chosen for a big daylight operation by the Americans to drop materials and arms to arm members of the resistance.
By late August, France was liberated. The Allies had triumphantly reached Paris. The French were free. For Atkins, there was further reason to be happy. Her application for British citizenship had been a success. Immediately after the city's liberation, Atkins travelled on her British passport to Paris. She was going to bring her agents home. The Hotel Cecil in Montmartre was the agreed meeting point for F Section agents. As they returned, Atkins was the one to greet them. By day, she arranged their repatriation. By night, she celebrated with them in the bars of Montmartre. But as the weeks passed, Atkins waited and waited. More than 100 agents still hadn't come back. Among them were 14 of Atkins' girls, including Yvonne Baseden. After 3 weeks, Atkins gave up her vigil and returned to England. Then in May 1945, nearly a year after D-Day, Yvonne Baseden eventually made her way back to London. She arrived at Euston Station.
I got out and I stood around and the crowds were all around me and I didn't know quite what to do. And so I just waited on the platform and eventually, as I couldn't see anyone, I thought, oh, what can I do?
Then someone came out of the crowds.
Someone called, hello, Yvonne, is that you? And there was Vera, and whom I recognized. I said, oh, Vera, how are you? Where am I going to now? And she said, oh, I'll take you to your father. He's just outside London. And I couldn't believe that was Vera. You know, there was no explanation. And she was just glad to pick me up.
But as Yvonne got talking to Atkins, she revealed disturbing news. After just 3 months in the field, she had been captured.
We were arrested on a Sunday, and it was a fine day. I was found and pulled out and chucked on the floor.
And there was more. For most of the last year, Yvonne had been held at the Nazi concentration camp, Ravensbrück. Atkins faced the reality that a similar fate may have fallen on her other missing agents.
One has the impression reading the papers of that period that none of them really believed that anyone English would ever end up in a concentration camp. It wasn't for us, certainly not for our boys or for our girls. The idea that women would end up in concentration camps was simply not, I don't think, ever considered.
And other details were emerging that made matters even worse for Atkins. The consequences of the overlooked security checks were becoming clear.
All the details became apparent that they themselves had actually dropped agents straight into enemy hands. It wasn't just that they were going to their desks and they were going out to a risky situation, but she'd actually seen agents off who, when they received the other end, were going to be received straight by the Gestapo. They were given no chance. And it was their own organisation, it was their own masters who had actually allowed them to fall into this lethal trap.
Faced with this, Atkins now embarked on an extraordinary mission. In December 1945, she set off alone into the chaos of war-torn Germany. Atkins was determined to find out what had happened to her girls. It was this extraordinary mission that would one day make her name. Hailed for her selfless commitment and sense of duty. But was there more to it than that? If Atkins really had, for whatever reason, covered up Buckmaster's mistakes and knowingly sent agents to their possible deaths, then Atkins was looking not only for her agents, but also for atonement. Whatever her motivation, Atkins faced a difficult task. Germany was flooded with millions of displaced people and refugees. The British government had never admitted to sending women behind enemy lines. So Atkins' girls weren't even named on the lists of the missing. But slowly, Atkins traced them. Atkins had last seen Madeleine Damerment in an airfield in West Sussex. She was one of dozens of agents who had been dropped into France after the Prosper disaster of 1943. Now Atkins found out what happened. The radio that had called Madeleine in had indeed been in German hands. When she touched down in France, the Gestapo were there to meet her. She had been taken to their Paris headquarters, where she was kept for 3 months, and interrogated by the secret police commander, Hans Josef Kiefer. From there, Atkins traced Madeleine's movements. At first to a women's prison in the town of Karlsruhe, and then to Dachau. The Americans had fought their way into Dachau in April 1945. The Americans would liberate 33,000 surviving inmates. But it was too late for Madeleine. For her story had ended here. At dawn on the 13th of September 1944, Madeleine had been dragged into the yard of the camp. For Vera Atkins, this was the stuff of nightmares. She had travelled to Germany hoping to find some agents alive. But the chances were they were all dead. Atkins continued the search for her other women, some of whom had worked for the Prosper Network. Such had been the infiltration of the circuit that they had stood little chance. One by one, they had been traced and captured. They too had been interrogated at the Gestapo headquarters before being sent to prison. But nothing could prepare Atkins for what she uncovered next. The girl's final destination was Natzweiler concentration camp. Natzweiler was a desolate place, designed to fulfill the Nazi policy of night and fog, an initiative to obliterate all trace of certain special prisoners. Atkins painstakingly tracked down evidence to piece together what had happened there. On the 6th of July 1944, Atkins' girls, Andre Borel, Vera Lee, and Diana Rowden, were given an injection and told they were being vaccinated against typhoid. But the syringe contained carbolic acid, a toxin designed to kill them. The women were then dragged to the crematorium where a guard was waiting to burn their bodies. Atkins gathered evidence in meticulous and distressing detail.
She herself heard everything, down to the fact that their clothes were taken off before they were actually put in the flames.
Another Natzweiler guard, Franz Berg, had witnessed the agents' deaths. He revealed to Atkins that the injections hadn't worked on at least one of the women.
There was evidence from one of the people working in the crematorium at the time that she had scratched the faces of another of the Germans and screamed as she was being put into the flames, all of which Vera heard.
It meant that one, or maybe even all of the women, had been burnt alive. By January 1947, Vera Atkins had discovered the fates of all F-section missing agents, bar one. 117 men and women had been killed by the Nazis. 11 of those were Atkins girls. When the Allies began to bring the Nazis to justice, Atkins stood as a vital witness at 2 war crimes trials. Her evidence saw those who had harmed her girls sentenced to death and executed. The case of the missing agents was closed. SOE was disbanded in January 1946. With it, the files on F Section were locked away. Maurice Buckmaster returned to his old job as a public relations officer for Ford. Vera Atkins too returned to civilian life, a British citizen and a respected member of British society. But she couldn't let SOE go. In the years after the war, she vigorously defended its work.
She became a sort of PR person almost for the SOE story. She became the conduit for all the families who were wanting information about their missing relatives and their sons and daughters and fathers. And they would go to her and she received their letters and wrote back to them, and she followed up on their stories.
Vera Atkins never acknowledged that anything had gone wrong at F Section. And she remained a highly secretive person.
She knew perfectly well this was something she would live with for the rest of her life, and the only way that she would be able to live with it was by extraordinary self-control and mental control.
No one can be certain why Vera Atkins had kept her silence in the summer of 1943 when the Prosper network was destroyed. Maybe she hadn't spotted the danger. Perhaps she really did have something to hide. Or maybe there was nothing she could have done. What isn't in doubt is the extraordinary responsibility Vera Atkins felt for her girls.
She was responsible for my going to France and my being in Ravensbrück and my getting out and so on. Indirectly, she was responsible for, and she knew that, you know, from all the agent's point of view, she had the responsibility. My goodness, what a responsibility.
The shadow of the F Section disaster stayed with Vera Atkins for life.
I remember absolutely everyone. André Borel, Diana Rowden, Cicely Lefort, Noor Inayat Khan, Violette Szabo.